Good morning. We continue today with the topic of proper mental filing. I said Tuesday that proper mental filing is a requirement because of the crow and the raven. The raven, again, is the fact that you can activate and put into working memory only a limited amount of data. It's the crow of the subconscious. It's like the limited amount of RAM you have in your desktop computer. And just as with your desktop computer, RAM is much faster than your hard drive. That's why people are always trying to buy more RAM to speed up the operations of the computer. Now here's a non-computer analogy. What's in focal awareness is what's in your hand right now. The sheets of paper, the documents, say a bill from Visa card that's in your hand right now. Then what's in working memory is not right in your hand, but it's right on your desk. And finally, what's somewhere in your brain but more remote is like what's in some box down in the basement. If the boxes in the basement are neatly shelved, well labeled, and if their contents are arranged for easy retrieval, you can go down there and fairly quickly get your hands on any item you want. But it does take a little time. To read the bill in your hand takes hardly any time. To get another bill from the papers on your desk takes maybe 10 seconds. To go down to the basement, open a box, pull out the right folder, bring it back up to your desk takes maybe 3 minutes. The Psycho-Epistemology says, to continue the analogy, you can only hold a few sheets, 7 at most, in your hand at once. I guess you have about 3 or 4 hands for the Psycho-Epistemology. Now, I mean, not hold them like this, but hold them separately so you can see each of them. The raven says, by analogy, you can fit only maybe 700 sheets of paper on your desktop. After that, piles start to fall over onto the floor. Is there any limit to what you can store in the basement? Effectively, no. The brain has some outer limits, but they're probably far in excess of what anyone has ever utilized. The relevance of the basement's identity is not that it's too small, but that it's so big. So many things get stored in long-term memory, the basement, that it becomes a big issue of how quickly can you locate the item that you want. Let's do a bit of psychological research right here now, even without government funding. Question 1. What room did I analogize to long-term memory? Okay. Question 2. What's the name of Ayn Rand's first novel? No difference in speed. No noticeable difference, right? Even though one of them you had to go down to the basement and get it out, the name of Ayn Rand's first novel. The other is what we've just been talking about, so it's right there in working memory. So things that are automatized, even if they're way out from left field, they rapidly can be accessed. Now let's take some others. What did you have for lunch yesterday? How many have got it by now? Okay. What did you have for lunch last Wednesday? Now, if you sit down, right, you can, some of you in your training, let's see, Wednesday, what day was that, where was I, when? You know, after a couple minutes, you probably can pull it up. What did you have for lunch on April 14th, 1987? So there you see that the real issue of time saving is the issue of how difficult is it to locate the information? It's not really the issue of the speed of RAM versus your hard drive, although that's in there. The real important issue is how long does it take to find the information in your memory? So the real issue is file organization. It is no good having some document down in the basement somewhere if there's such a jumble down there that you can't find it. And for the things you can find, there's still a difference in time for locating it. So what? Well, speed matters. This is the topic I call the need for speed. It's another way of looking at the need for unit economy that is imposed by the Raven. Contrary to politically correct notions, faster is better. A good illustration is the case of computers. There's hardly anything that a computer can do that couldn't be done without the computer, only much more slowly. Essentially, all that a computer adds is speed. Speed in the same kind of operations that we did before computers, making calculations, editing written material, retrieving information, communicating. All that it adds is speed, but speed makes all the difference. Sure, you could travel around the world to several different libraries and look up the same information that you can get in 5 minutes on the web. But would you do it? Is that realistic? No, not unless you knew this information was crucial and you had no other options. But being able to hop around from site to site on the web, following almost instantaneously links to the world's databases, means that you can jump to any location which looks even possibly helpful. Whereas if you had to physically travel to each site in person, you'd have to very strictly narrow down your field of consideration. In physical travel, you wouldn't have the time or the money to check out leads that you can jump to immediately by the super rapid virtual travel of cyberspace. The difference is the speed. Sure, you could take a couple of days, sit down and handwrite 50 letters, fold them, address them by hand, stuff them in envelopes, seal them, stamp them, and take them to a mailbox. Or you can maintain an email distribution list and do the same task in 5 minutes. At which rate are you most likely to maintain communications and the interchange of ideas with the widest number of people? The speed of the computer is an incredible value because it allows you to do more work in the same time and to do work that simply wouldn't get done at all without that speed. The same need for speed exists in the human mind, only much more so. In thinking, the need for speed is magnified because thinking is not a mechanical process. If you're mailing out those 50 letters, at least you know exactly what to do. It is a mechanical process. You're perfectly confident that if you spend the time, you can accomplish the task. But now take a thinking task. Suppose you want to discover something new. Suppose you want to solve the problem of induction. Now the situation is radically different from just mailing out those letters. You don't think, oh, solving the problem of induction, that's a long, tedious task, and I can estimate fairly well that it'll take me 2 weeks or a month to do it. You can't say, if I have the time to solve the problem of induction, there's simply no question about my succeeding. Thinking is not a mechanical process. Nobody knows all the exact steps required to discover new knowledge. Aristotle gave us the general idea of what to do, base everything on sense perception, and A is A. Ayn Rand gave us many more principles of epistemology. But creative thinking still has not been reduced to a series of easy steps, however many of them, that can be done by rote the way that doing a mailing can be. I don't think creative thinking ever can be reduced to a series of simple rote steps. Creative thinking is hard. It involves doubt. Does it? Well, yeah, I guess so. It involves tentative ideas, testing, discarding wrong leads. No, you don't discard. Yes, you do discard wrong. And so on. You can't map your route in advance in creative thinking because you usually don't know yet what real route will get you to your destination because you don't know the unknown. You often don't even know if you are getting closer or moving farther away, whether you're spiraling around or just running in circles. To get anywhere in a thinking task of any difficulty, you need all the help you can get from your mental equipment. You need to make your subconscious work for you. Specifically, you need to have working memory contain the greatest possible quantity of relevant information and the smallest possible quantity of irrelevant information. How do you do that? You do it by proper organization of the boxes in your basement, i.e. of your stored knowledge. Proper equals what? Logically organized. Okay, meaning what? Organized according to essential similarities and differences in reality. Meaning what? Meaning you need definitions. The method of organizing the boxes in your basement, the method of gaining speed is definitions. Your concepts, especially your more abstract concepts, need to have clear definitions. So definitions are important not because of some epistemological duty, and not merely to protect you from error, but for a practical psycho-epistemological reason. Definitions permit fast retrieval of the most relevant information, so that information is what occupies working memory. Without definitions, you'd be so slowed down that thought of any complexity would be just impossible. We'll see this from an example coming up. So let's look at definitions. Here's where we get to the practical advice. As you know, definitions consist of two parts, a genus and a differential. The genus is the wider class which contains both the concept's units and its nearest relatives, the things from which you are distinguishing the concept's units. For instance, in man is the rational animal. What's the genus? Animal. Animal is the wider class that contains man, the species, and man's nearest relatives, dogs, pigs, cows. So animal is the genus, and that's an example of a genus. What about the other part, the differentia? The differentia is a distinguishing characteristic. What is a distinguishing characteristic? It's a characteristic that distinguishes. It's a characteristic possessed by all and only the units of the concept you are defining, and therefore isolates its units from the other things in the genus. A characteristic that distinguishes the units from its nearest relatives. Rational is the differentia in the definition of man. It distinguishes man from dogs and pigs. Now, you could also define man as the animal with a sense of humor, or the animal who can darn socks. Those are also distinguishing characteristics of man. Pigs don't darn socks. Cows don't have much of a sense of humor. But if you read what's that cartoonist? Far Side, you might. So, sock darning and sense of humor and many other things are also candidates for a differential. They are also distinguishing characteristic. They're not good differentiae, but They are things that isolate man. They do distinguish. The trouble with them is not that they're too broad or too narrow. They do pick out man from the other animals, but they are superficial. That's what makes man as the sock-darning animal a lousy definition. It distinguishes man from cows and pigs, all right, but in a superficial and non-helpful fashion. The essential characteristic is one of the distinguishing characteristics. It's the one which is fundamental. Please get that. The essential characteristic is a type of distinguishing characteristic. The fundamental one. So that's the two parts of a definition, the genus and the differential, and your differential should be the essential distinguishing characteristic, not a superficial one. We'll return to the differential and the topic of essentials a little later. But first we have to discuss the genus and its psycho-epistemological significance. Now that I've outlined what genus and differential are in an overview, let's go back to look at the genus from a psycho-epistemological standpoint. I have become very big on the need for identifying a genus. To know the genus of all your concepts is immensely empowering. To be a genius, find the genus. This is one aphorism you could store in your subconscious. Getting the genus is comparatively easy. That's to help motivate you. And it's immensely valuable. It's a big step towards the integration of your knowledge. I began to see the importance of the genus when I was teaching logic back in college in the 70s. One day when I was on the topic of definitions, I worked through some simple examples, like man and table. And then I was ready to give the class a harder one. I asked them to define inflation. This was in the mid-70s, and inflation was a big concern to everyone. I began by asking them the genus of inflation. Now, I wanted something like economic condition. One student raised his hand and volunteered when I asked what's the genus of inflation. He said, money. I wanted to show him he was in the wrong basic category. It might be called a monetary condition, but it's not money. The genus of inflation is not money. Money is a commodity, an entity really, but inflation is a condition. To help him see his error, I asked him, well, what's the genus of money? Without batting an eye, he answered, survival. Shocked but intrigued, I asked him, and what's the genus of survival? Food, he offered. We went on like this through about 3 more concepts, wandering around in his hopelessly disorganized filing system until I gave up. I wondered, really frightened, what was the state of the mental equipment of such a student? What do you think his basement looks like? Project yourself for a moment into his psychoepistemology. It's pure chaos. You wouldn't know up from down, and you couldn't think. This student was connecting concepts by sheer association instead of by genus. The organization of his mental files was simply this. Inflation, that relates to money. Money, that relates to survival. Survival, that relates to food, and so on. Now, all these relations do exist. Money does relate to survival. Survival does relate to food, etc. Only they are all different types of relation. So what, you might ask? Well, so this. Consider the practical results on your thinking. Now, this was the 1970s, remember, so let's go back in our minds to that time. You were wondering, what is the cause of inflation? Well, let's not make it you. That would be too insulting. He is wondering what is the cause of inflation. Is it a conspiracy of oil producers to hold supplies offshore, as he reads in the newspaper? Is the solution for inflation for people to be less greedy, as President Carter is saying on TV? Now, here's the way you would approach it with your rational filing system. If you have inflation filed under its proper genus, economic condition, what gets put into working memory, along with data on inflation, is data on other related economic conditions, such as what? Well, notably deflation. Right away, notice this. If inflation is due to greed, then it seems that deflation would be due to lack of greed. Too much self-denial. That doesn't sound right. During the last huge deflation now, the Great Depression, it didn't seem that people were unconcerned with getting money. The same for conspiracies to restrict supply as the cause of inflation. Is deflation a time when there's too little held off the market? When there aren't enough manipulators trying to exploit the public? Not very plausible. Now you can proceed positively to ask what distinguishes inflation from deflation. The answer to that question, I'm just going to kind of run through some logical issues that would arise without nailing any of them down. I just want you to see the sequence of connected issues. What distinguishes inflation from deflation? The answer to that question will take you to the file folder on price levels. And the folder on price levels will take you to the folder on supply and demand. And the subfolder on demand will take you to the folder on the quantity of money. And that will lead you to the hypothesis that inflation is an expansion of the money supply in relation to the supply of goods produced, while deflation is a contraction of the money supply in relation to production. That's how you would see it because you have things filed under their genus. But now let's return to my weird student. He thought the genus of inflation was money. So he's considering what he reads in the paper and hears on TV. Now he pulls up the inflation folder. Along with it comes the money folder. So what's in that folder? Well, given that its genus, he said, was survival, we can guess that in his money folder is something like the following. Money is like dollar bills and coins and stuff. Money is stored in like banks. Bankers are fat cats, my sociology professor says. Money is real important. It helps people survive. To buy their food, for instance. The poor don't have enough money. And I could use a lot more money. The more money people have, the better off they are, etc., etc. Where is this mess likely to lead him? Inflation makes things more expensive and people can't survive and stuff. So they should print up more dollar bills and send them to the poor. And to me. So you see my point. Inflation, you need to activate the context of inflation versus deflation, not inflation versus money. Inflation versus money is not a differentiation, nor is the next of his levels, money versus survival. That's not a differentiation. That's just a disparity. To have an organized mind, a mind that will feed you relevant data, you need to have a nested chain of genera. Genera is the plural of genus. It's not genus says, it's genera. So you need to have a nested chain of genera. Genus inside wider genus, inside wider genus, inside wider genus. You have to see that man is an animal is an organism is an entity. Or dollar bills are currency, currency is money, money is a commodity, or claims to a commodity is an entity. That's the kind of structure of links that brings order into your subconscious files, that cleans up your basement, making your files into a system, not just a heap. So when you go down to the basement, you can find in one or two places, very quickly, all the most relevant information. Now that's why you can't remember what you had for lunch on April 14th, 1987. You don't file under that heading. You don't file lunches by date, so you can't retrieve it. Probably it's in your brain somewhere. You just can't get to it. So the issue of how your concepts are organized comes down to the issue of what is the nature of the network of links you have formed between your concepts. The species to genus relationship, as man to animal, or money to commodity. The species to genus relationship is extremely direct and intimate. For example, it's the relationship of tables to furniture. So when you identify the genus of a species, the link between the species and the genus is very, very strong. Probably the strongest form of link that there is, because one of those concepts has been formed out of the other. When you have identified the correct genus for a concept, then focusing on that concept automatically puts into working memory the file on its nearest relatives too. And that's the best wider context you can have for thinking about the concept's units. That's a theoretical explanation of why it turns out to be important to file by genus, to identify the genus, which means you will file by it. So the psycho-epistemological advice is, give yourself a standing order to go wider. Identify the genus of your concepts, that's going wider for concepts, and by an analogous principle, try to find the wider genus, the wider principle behind your principles. That's how going wider applies to principles. To sell you further on going wider, consider a different kind of example. You observe, just empirically, that rent control leads to housing shortages. If you've filed rent control under its proper genus, government controls on prices, it becomes very easy to ask yourself whether it's qua housing or qua controls that the shortage has arisen. It's obviously because of the controls, not because it's housing rather than milk. And so you can see very easily what people don't see today. That, for example, milk controls or controls on the rates of interest that banks can charge will lead to shortages in those fields, shortages of milk or shortages of bank loans. And then it's easy to reach the principle, price controls lead to shortages. It's a very simple induction. And then you can go on by the same process to the even wider principle, government intervention in the economy is destructive. And the still wider principle that laws which violate rights are destructive. And to the still wider principle that the anti-mind is the anti-life. Now I'm skipping a few steps, obviously, but in each case it is by seeing the wider principle, by going to the wider principle, by looking at in effect, the genus of your principle, although that's a metaphorical way of talking about it. It's by going to the wider principle that you're easily led to more and more important truths. But now let's suppose that someone is not filed by the genus. Suppose he thinks of rent controls as something that keeps rents low. That's probably how most people file rent controls. Something that keeps rents low. That's not insane like my weird student who says inflation is money, money is survival, survival is food. It's just lazy. Because you see, something is not a genus here. Something that keeps rents low. Filing it that way breeds concrete boundedness. Nothing suggests to the person who holds it this way to connect rent controls to controls on milk prices, nor to controls on interest rates, nor to any other violation of rights. The question of the relationship of rent control to these other status measures simply will not occur to him. His subconscious won't feed it to him. It's not in working memory. That's not a matter of his motivation. It's not a matter of some anti-capitalist bias. Perhaps if you, who do think in principles, ask this person the relevant questions, he could give the right answer on those questions and be led to see the wider points. But those questions will just not occur to him if he has filed rent control as something that keeps rents low. Now notice another aspect here that can sabotage a person's psychoepistemology. Rent control is something that keeps rents low. Well, another thing that keeps rents low is an abundant supply of housing. There's the fact of supply and demand, after all, as well as the interventionism of the government. So if you asked yourself, what is something that keeps milk prices low? One correct answer would be a lot of dairy farms producing a lot of milk. So you might be led then to the generalization, keeping prices low is a good thing in an economy because you have used the concept something as your genus rather than the concept forcing by governmental edict. Something keeping prices low here is a package deal. It packages together governmental coercion with the law of supply and demand. It packages subjective factors dictated by pressure group politics and objective factors determined by the state of production. So here we see a connection between epistemology and psychoepistemology. Epistemology tells you, defined by genus and differential, reject package deals. If you don't follow these epistemological principles, the psychoepistemological result will be connections are made too difficult to grasp. Certain questions don't occur to you. For example, the question of, is there a relation between limits on interest rates and rent control? And you will be led down blind alleys. For example, sometimes keeping prices low is desirable, as when there are lots of dairy farms bustling along. Sometimes keeping prices low is undesirable, as under rent control. Your mind is paralyzed. Automatizing the package deal, things that keep prices low, ignoring whether the thing is an edict or a fact of the free market, forces you psychoepistemologically into pragmatism. You just have to conclude, we don't know whether low prices will work or not. Sometimes they do, like in the dairy farm case. Sometimes they don't, like in rent control. There are no absolutes, we just have to try it and see. So package deals are not only bad epistemologically, they are psychoepistemological paralyzers. All right, that's what I have to say about the genus. Let's turn now to the other part of mental organization, getting the differential. Once you have a genus, the next step is to isolate the units by finding the proper differential. The proper differential is one of the distinguishing characteristics. Which one? The essential one. What makes a distinguishing characteristic qualify as essential? That it's fundamental. What is it to be a fundamental? It's to be the distinguishing characteristic that underlies and makes possible the greatest number of other distinguishing characteristics. So the proper differential is the essential distinguishing characteristic, which means the fundamental one. Now, there is a specific mental process required to identify that a characteristic qualifies as essential. That process is finding the connection among the distinguishing characteristics you know. For example, to see that rational is the essential distinguishing characteristic for man, you have to step back and consider the connection between man's other distinctive characteristics and his rational faculty. The process is simply that you see Man's history, his darning socks, his ability to get the point of a joke, build houses, do mathematics, engage in trade, and so on, are all made possible by his ability to think. The specific mental act that organizes your knowledge by essentials is testing. Testing to see which distinguishing characteristic derives from which. So let's concretize that. Let's do that. This is the act. The point of applied psychoepistemology is to get beyond good, nice generalizations like go to fundamentals and tell you exactly what to do step by step in your mind. So to find the essential, you have to test characteristics against each other one by one. Let me show you what we do. Does man's ability to get a joke derive from his ability to use reason, or does his ability to use reason derive from his ability to get a joke? Okay, well, the answer is obvious. Score 1 for reason. Does his ability to darn socks derive from his ability to think, or vice versa? Score 2 for reason. Does his possession of a thumb derive from his use of reason, or vice versa? Neither. So that's a standoff. Actually, I think that reason is the fundamental here too, but to see that, I'd have to make an evolutionary argument, which I won't go into. I deliberately included the thumb example to illustrate the fact that not everything has to reduce to the fundamental. It's just that a greater number of things reduce to this thing that you call the fundamental than to any other candidate. Does man's ability to speak a language derive from his use of reason, or vice versa? Score 3 for reason, and so on. So you see, the test for essentiality, the test for fundamentality, is to apply the characteristics that you know against each other one by one and ask, which comes from which? Does A come from B or B come from A? And then the one that totals up the greatest number is being the cause rather than the effect. That's the fundamental. That's the one you use as your differential in your definition. Now note what we have done here. We didn't just make a connection, like man is a rational animal. We saw a meta-connection, a connection among the connections that we've previously identified. We ordered our links by finding the trunk of the branching tree of distinguishing characteristics. Look at it this way. When you see that man darns his socks, you have formed a one-to-one connection. Men and only men can darn socks. Connect men to socks. That is a distinguishing characteristic. When you identify that man is a rational animal, you form a similar one-to-one link. Men and only men are rational animals. Men, rational animals. The same is true if you identify that man has a sense of humor. Man, sense of humor. But to see that being a rational animal is man's essential characteristic is something different. It's to see that rationality underlies all or most of the other characteristics. So seeing a characteristic as essential is establishing a one-to-many link in your mind. This one-to-many link that an identification of an essential represents is what allows us to condense a vast realm of information so that it will be manageable, so that it can fit both the crow and the raven. As for the crow, when you think rationality is man's essence, you imply all the derivatives you have linked to that one fact. As for the raven, when you grasp and file by man's essence is rationality, you've activated and put into working memory the one fact that is linked to and drags with it into working memory all or most of the other distinguishing characteristics you know of man. By identifying essentials as essentials, you achieve the filing goal that we identified at the outset of this lecture. to have working memory contain the greatest possible quantity of relevant information and the smallest possible quantity of irrelevant information. The same condensation applies to other concepts in other fields. For example, politics. For the person who thinks in essentials, who's identified the essentials in the field of politics, politics is strongly linked to rights and force. In economics, the essentials in economics which would have strong links to anything in the field are production, money, and the division of labor. If you identify an essential as an essential, your concept is linked to the trunk of the tree rather than to a branch off a branch off a branch at the periphery. That's how linking concepts to essentials as essentials makes it easy to think efficiently. Now, all knowledge is good knowledge. All knowledge is valuable to possess. It's good to know that man is capable of sock darning. I'm not against that. It's good to know that man has a sense of humor. But identifying their base as the faculty of reason is what makes all that knowledge work for you. Finding the fundamental is what gives your subconscious the ability, despite limited working memory, the raven, to have the most fertile knowledge available to you right at your fingertips or right on your desktop. My next topic is, big shift here. Flush your buffers, clear off your desktops, get ready to drag in stuff from the basement from a different area. My next topic is how to mobilize the subconscious in problem solving. Problem solving is a process of asking oneself questions. Here's a quick 3-step guide to the hardest question, which is what questions to ask. In order to know what questions to ask, you've got to do 3 things. I'll list them and then discuss them separately. Set up the problem properly, concretize it, run a thought experiment on the concretes. Set it up, concretize it, thought experiment. First, setting up the problem. A under that heading. When you have a problem, the first task is to shrink it. You have to delimit the problem, cut away anything that you don't have to solve. Consider breaking it into subproblems. Suppose, for instance, someone has treated you in a way that made you angry, and you are trying to understand the meaning of his action from a philosophical perspective. Lots of things are rolling around in your mind. Delimit the issue. Let's say what you are really concerned with is, what is justice anyway? Not what was his motivation or how unexpected and shocking his behavior was. But let's just take as what you're really interested in the topic of what is justice, because you've been treated unjustly and it's right on your mind. The more you can narrow the issue like that and clear away the irrelevancies, the more powerful your thinking will be because of the crow limits. It's like going from a shovel to a steam shovel to narrow down the issue. You have limited mental equipment and limited time, so get rid of any weight you don't have to lift. Now, the next thing, in the process of delimiting, narrowing, trimming down your question, you should be specific. There's a big difference between these 2 formulations of your question. 1, what is the right way to treat people? 2, what is a just way to treat people? Right is too generalized. But justice brings up information on perhaps what fairness is as contrasted to unfair, which you can easily work with, get examples of. B, formulate the issue. Find the words that are meaningful and productive for you. This is still under setting up the problem. For example, I just said fair versus unfair. For me, those are emotionally more loaded terms and therefore more helpful. Emotional loading is a good thing. Fair versus unfair might help when justice versus injustice seems too academic. Also, justice connotes social issues, which are not as simple as person-to-person issues. But in any case, find the words that are rich in meaning for you. It's amazing the extent to which people don't do that. Now, this presupposes that you have the right words to begin with. If interdependence and polarization are the part of the vocabulary that you're carrying around and you consider those to be meaningful to you, you don't have a problem here thinking about justice, you have an earlier problem. Because of the crow and the raven, your formulation should be as short as possible. Now, this is so mindless, I'm embarrassed to, bring it up. Only it's the obvious mindless things that you have to give yourself a standing order not to forget. For example, what is justice is 3 words. That's a good short formulation. Don't formulate it as, what are the principles that should guide a volitionally rational being in a moral way in regard to those aspects of his behavior which affect the other people with whom he deals? Now, logically, those two are pretty much the same thing, but psycho-epistemologically, one works, the other doesn't. C under point 1. Identify the kind of problem that it is. For example, this really goes under the heading of go wider. For example, is it a dilemma? Is it a seeming contradiction between theory and practice? Are you searching for a method? For a principle? For a causal connection? Here you're looking for a principle. What is justice? If you know the type of problem, you can get help by looking at other similar problems of that type that you've already solved and understand well, and see how you did it. Here you're looking for a principle, the principle of justice. So consider analogous problems of determining principles. For example, maybe your understanding the principle of honesty will help you understand justice. Or more likely, maybe your understanding of the principle of causality will help, since justice is, in effect, people getting undeflected by others' intervention, the effects of the causes they enact. But in any case, if you name the kind of problem that it is, you take control of it, you know how, in principle, to solve problems of that type. All right, that's all under setting up the problem. Now, the second step is to concretize. And this is one of the biggest topics in these 2 lectures, the most important topics in these 2 lectures. Doesn't mean I can spend the most time on it, however. So I'm just going to shout to emphasize. The more abstract the subject is, the more you have to concretize. Concretization is not an aid to thinking, it is the thinking. Thinking is in concretes. Now that's a shocking statement. But that's what I've been led to by introspection. Thinking is working with concretes. Now, it's working with them in a conceptual context. But as you'll see, you can't think in connections among abstractions without reference to concretes. For years, objectivist students of philosophy have been told, look at reality. Don't be a rationalist. Look at reality. Well, my question was always, where is it? I'd be happy to look there, but I don't know where reality is until you tell me the answer to this thing, and then I know where to look. Well, reality is the concretes. Plato was wrong. Abstractions don't exist in reality. To look at reality means to look at the concretes you're dealing with. If you're thinking about why does man need art, what should go through your mind is concrete examples of artworks. Atlas Shrugged, Michelangelo's David, Vermeer's View of Delft, Salvador Dali's Crucifixion. Whatever painting stands in your mind as a magnificent example of painting. The first thing to consider is not art is a selective recreation of reality according to Inar's metaphysical value judgments. I found in my own thinking that any question I've been able to answer, I answer by thinking in examples. I'm going to give you a personal example a little later. Thinking in concretes enables you to use in the theoretical disciplines the equivalent of the laboratory method in the hard sciences. It's the experimental method. You run thought experiments. More on this in a minute, but first I have to tell you that for concretization to work, to be able to think in examples and at the same time be thinking in principles, you have to pick the right examples. There are principles for choosing examples. Now I have 4 criteria for picking good examples. I think they're all self-evident once named, but people disobey this all the time. Examples should be 4 things: clear, simple, dramatic, and diverse. Now I'll take them up one at a time. Clear, simple, dramatic, and diverse. Examples should be clear, A. They shouldn't be confusing or vague. They should be clear qua examples. That is, they should clearly, easily illustrate the abstraction. You know that according to the objectivist theory of concepts, concepts include all the concretes whose measurements lie within a certain range. So what you want are not examples from near the edges of the range, but from the center. Borderline cases are not good examples because they qualify as examples only in a weakened or attenuated form. I think that's clear. B, examples should be simple. To illustrate art, for example, music is not a good example. It's too complex, too little understood, too hard to handle. You can come back to music later once you've understood painting, literature, sculpture. Architecture is not a good example to start with either because it combines art with a utilitarian purpose. Or to illustrate individual rights, you should not take the right to abortion or the right to self-defense as your thinking examples for the same reason. They're derivative cases, they're further from perception, they carry a greater risk of error, and are just more difficult to work with. C, examples should be dramatic. They should be emotionally powerful for you. They should be emotionally important to you because values are the motor of cognition. You stimulate your mind by taking emotionally powerful examples, and you're likely to have a lot of associations to your examples. So a lot of links are being pulled in. So in thinking about art, some work by Chekhov is not good compared to Atlas. Finally, examples should be diverse enough to cover the field, to range over the whole field. For example, justice. You're thinking about justice. Say your first example that occurs to you is a man does good work and gets paid well. Another does badly and gets fired. You should immediately realize that you have left out some important other categories. For example, legal justice, and spiritual justice. So what are the relevant categories? Well, for instance, business versus personal is not a philosophical categorization. It's very fine for some issues, but it's not the right way to approach an issue like justice. To the extent that your filing is haphazard, you don't have the right categories. So the way you have the right categories is that you originally filed by genus. So this goes back to our early point. Now here's some categories within which to find examples of justice. Individual to individual justice. individual to society justice, society to society justice. What would be an example of society to society justice? International relations. Is there a just war, or are all wars inherently unjust? If your topic is does justice pay, you would probably begin with a monetary example. But then if you've got monetary, you should immediately think the opposite. Spiritual. Paying compliments to a friend. That's a non-monetary example, but still justice is involved. Now in each case, I could give you other categories. But you have to take diverse examples from different categories. You have to know what the subcategories are. Now, as for the number of examples, I have to tell you no more than 3. Sorry, that's it. One problem with examples is having too many for the crow. And even if you have 3, you have to work with them one against one. For example, being paid well and getting for doing good work, being fired for doing bad work. You can't contrast 3 against 3. You have to contrast 1 against 1. So you want no more than 3 for spiritual justice, no more than 3 for material justice, no more than 3 for legal justice, etc. Finally, 3. This is the final one, thought experiments. When you have picked your examples, the next step is to run a thought experiment. Your thought experiment consists of differentiating and integrating. You ask what makes the examples of justice differ from the examples of injustice. What is the common denominator, the integrating principle, uniting the examples of justice? Now, thought experiments is a large topic which I can only indicate by giving an example of the kind of thought experiment I mean. And I'm not going to take it from justice because that's too hard. I have a very neat one. Forgive me, it's a personal example. Most of you know that I came up with an original theory of goal-directed action. Here's how I did it. My problem was to understand what goal-directed action is. Specifically, I wanted to understand Ayn Rand's statement that goal-directed action is based on the alternative of life or death, existence or non-existence. It seemed to me that it did, that she was right, but I couldn't see why. So I took an example of goal-directed action. My example was an earthworm moving away from a dangerous source of heat. Moving away from the heat preserves its existence, but preservation is only the result. Why does it qualify as the goal of the earthworm's motion? I needed an example to differentiate living action from. So I thought of a case where something inanimate would be preserved in existence by moving away from heat that would otherwise destroy it. Obviously, the simplest thing that's destroyed by heat is ice. So I thought of an ice cube that would melt if it were heated. And this seems similar to, but still essentially different from an earthworm being killed by heat. So I pictured in my mind the following thought experiment. I imagined that an earthworm and an ice cube were placed at the top of a slightly slanted board. A sun lamp is focused on both. The earthworm soon gets too hot and inches its way down the board, away from the heat. But at the same time, the ice cube would start to melt, and that would make it get slippery, so it starts to slide down the board away from the heat. So the ice cube also results in preserving itself in existence qua ice cube. Both motions, the earthworms and the ice cubes, resulted in the preservation of the entity as that kind of entity. But what's the difference? Well, it immediately struck me, once I'd set it up that way, that the answer is that the earthworm moves away from the heat because the heat is bad for it. The cause of the earthworm's action is the survival value of the result. But the ice cube moves away from the heat simply because that's the way the board happened to be tilted. If the board were laid flat, the ice cube would remain where it is and just melt. But the earthworm would still inch away from the heat. So this thought experiment showed me that the earthworm moved away from the heat because heat is bad for its life. But the ice cube, if it moved, would not move because of the relationship of the heat to its continued existence qua ice cube. And that became the basis for my doctoral dissertation, which later became my book on teleological concepts, available from Second Renaissance Books. I'm sorry I have to leave thought experiments at this sketchy level, but time is running out. In fact, to finish the rest of the material, I have to go into take up time from the question period. I do expect to write on the subject of thought experiments in the future. In the time remaining, or what should be remaining, let's turn to an entirely different subject, even further flushing the buffer, clearing the desktop. The applied psychoepistemology of dealing with emotions. The applied psychoepistemology of dealing with emotions. I promised this in the catalog description, so I feel I have to take the time to cover it, even though we're officially over. Emotions, as you know, are the psychosomatic form in which people experience their value judgments. An emotion is a response to a subconscious evaluation according to the values one has automatized. Psychoepistemologically, this means that emotions have a voice, and their voice comes from the same place as the voice of reason. Isn't that kind of shocking? The temptation is to say, listen to your reason, not to your emotions. Listen to your brain, not to your heart. But emotions don't come from your heart. Emotions come from your brain too. Emotions, like the content of your rational thinking, come from your subconscious, from the same place in your subconscious, approximately. So what then is the difference between your emotions and your thinking? Here are two of several differences. One, the evaluation behind your emotion is your first impression. It's in effect a snap judgment. So to side with or go by your emotions means to go with your snap judgment. Two, your emotion may come from a wrong value. A value which you have consciously rejected as not really being a value, but which is still held as a value in your subconscious. Why might it still be held as a value in your subconscious? Because it's automatized. You have regarded it as a value for so long that taking it as a value has become a habit. And habits are not eliminated by just one or two occasions of consciously rejecting them. Automatized misevaluations have to be eliminated gradually by replacing them with proper evaluations, using your conscious mind to hold in mind the full context of the reasons why you've changed your opinion. I leave aside here the issue of repression. That's for clinical psychoepistemology. What do you do mentally to deal with emotions that are either inappropriate or so intense that they are cognitively disruptive, threatening to make you lose your objectivity? The answer is what I call going to the meta level. Meta here doesn't relate to metaphysical. It means a level one step removed from the case at hand. Not wider, but on a different level. For example, this is how philosophers use the term. The statement, let's have lunch, is on the first level. But if I say, I just made the statement, let's have lunch, then that's on the meta level. It's a statement about a statement. It's a meta statement. Another example, I said that when you see that man is a rational animal, that is making a connection between concepts. But when you see the fact that man is a rational animal is an essential, you see a connection among connections among concepts. That's on the meta level. So what does going to the meta level mean in the case of emotions? The first thing it means is naming the emotion that you're feeling and that you're feeling it. Naming your emotions is a surprisingly big help to gaining objectivity on them. Consider the difference between that goddamn bastard. And I am really furious with that guy. The second is on the meta level. It's consciousness of consciousness. Now, I'm not saying it's bad to think that goddamn bastard when that results from some real injustice he has done you. But in the meta level identification, I am furious at him. You have switched your focus to your evaluation of him, and you are, for the moment, not the angry person, but the observer of anger. You have distanced yourself somewhat from the anger by focusing on what you were feeling. Another example. I hate him. Which might sound like it's on the meta level, but the way I did it, it isn't. And here's the meta level. I feel I need to destroy him. I guess a real first level statement would have been, and then, I feel I need to destroy him. Going to the meta level gives you an ability to control your emotions, which you can't do if you don't know that you're feeling them. It's really amazing but true that in having an emotion, there's no inherent tendency at all to name it. Just being frightened, angry, bored doesn't in the slightest lead you to identify that those are the emotions you're feeling. But it's very important to do so, not only because they are snap judgments that may be wrong, or they represent snap judgments that may be wrong, but also because they help you identify your values. Here's an embarrassing personal example. It was only after 2 years of teaching that I realized I loved teaching. You see, the process of teaching wraps you up so totally in it that you don't have an ounce of mental strength left to step back and go to the meta level and say, hey, I'm really loving this. If you'd asked me in the first year of my teaching, I would have acknowledged, yeah, I feel positively about teaching, but I had no idea that I really loved it. Naming your emotions puts you in control even if you don't know the cause of the emotions yet. This fact is well known regarding so-called panic attacks or anxiety attacks. Just knowing that you're having a panic attack, just naming that, already reduces the fear about 50%. Because you know there's a defined thing, it's called a panic attack, it's a knowable state with a natural cause, and that's very calming. That is stepping back to identify, not just to be panicked, but to say, I'm panicked, this happens sometimes. This is not necessarily some incredible, terrible, mystical thing happening. Naming your emotions is the first step to understanding them. You can't understand them, let alone judge their appropriateness, until you know that you're feeling them and which one you are feeling. Going to the meta level to see yourself having an emotion establishes a certain separation between your ego and the emotion. For example, suppose you have a fear about doing something, as in starting some big project. You don't even want to confront the issue because you feel it will be disastrous. Now, an objectivist would probably be tempted to just push himself, make himself do the fearful thing. And that's not so bad. But better than that is, rather than trying to make yourself plunge in by just sheer willpower, go to the meta level. Tell yourself, I don't have to do the thing I don't want to do. All I have to do is think about why I don't want to do it. Or you fear going to the dentist. Tell yourself, I don't have to go to the dentist. All I have to do is talk it over in my mind, think it out. That reduces the fear. Contemplating the trip to the dentist, imagining yourself in the chair, is really frightening. But going on to the meta level and thinking about what to do and whether there is some way out of the problem is not really frightening. Sit down and list all the bad things that could happen to you at the dentist and why you're afraid of them. Your worst fear is of the unknown. Once you start making a list of what's the worst that can happen, you'll find almost always, oh, it's not as bad as I thought it was. Now here, in the process of introspecting your emotions, you have to give yourself the freedom to side with them. If you decide consciously and rationally that what they are telling you turns out actually to be right. For example, you don't have to go to the dentist if you really think it's too awful and you'd rather have your teeth fall out. You have to hold a little trial in your mind, and a fair trial, not a rigged one. Give your reason a chance to make its case, and then give your subconscious, your emotions, the chance to make its case. Your subconscious will be very happy to supply you with all the reasons why you shouldn't do the thing. Or on the other hand, why you should do the thing that you think you shouldn't. You are a free agent. Only your values oblige you. If you go to the meta level and monitor what your emotions are saying to you, hold that little trial in your mind, one of two things will happen. Take the case of the fear of doing something. You will either decide my emotions turn out to be right, this is just too awful, I'm not going to do it, or you will decide this really isn't so awful, my emotions were wrong, I'm going to do it. You continue the trial until, at least for that moment, your emotions and your reason are in harmony. The emotion that your trial has impeached, if it does impeach your emotion, that emotion will disappear, at least for the moment. If you've gotten to the real issue and found a mistake has been made in your evaluation, that wrong emotion, inappropriate emotion, will go away. Now, I hasten to add that 15 seconds later, it'll come back. Or it may come back. Why? Because its source is automatized. It's your habitual way of appraising this kind of thing. And the habit takes over as soon as you release the conscious reins by turning your attention somewhere else. But it'll come back with slightly less strength. You've taken one step to erasing that habit. But you should monitor in your trial whether or not your emotions are starting to change as you get to the real issue. Or in the other case, if your considered judgment starts to change and you find out that your emotions were right in the first place. That does sometimes happen. In dealing with your own subconscious, you have to adopt a certain attitude. You have to be patient, open, benevolent. Do not look on your own subconscious with disgust, contempt, hatred, or even angry suspiciousness. You can get angry, really angry, at a specific idea in your subconscious. There's that damn premise again. I hate that premise. But you can't get angry at your subconscious for holding that idea. That would only foster repression, and it's unjust. Your subconscious has no will of its own. It is supplying you with the only emotional reaction it can, according to the values which you taught it to hold. Let me add here something that Ayn Rand once told me. When you're trying to correct an automatized habit, focus on the positive. Give yourself credit for the times you catch yourself acting according to the mistaken habit. Don't say, "Oh, there I did it again." Catching it is a good thing. It's the beginning of correcting the habit. Focus on the fact that, not that you did it, but that you caught it. Rather than berating yourself for the times that you don't catch it, give yourself credit for the few times you do catch it, and you will increase the number of times you catch it. I find that advice helpful and liberating. Going to the meta level also permits you to break out of the loop. The conflict, the loop of the conflict between I've got to, but I can't. Or I want to, but I mustn't. As long as you're looking only at the two alternatives, the lady or the tiger, you're trapped in a dilemma. You're stuck. But when you go to the meta level, very often you can find a way out of the dilemma. In the conflict between reason and emotion, there's often a third way, a way that satisfies both, which means a way that reason endorses. For example, in the case of the dentist, instead of just thinking, shall I go and suffer or not go and have my teeth fall out, go to the meta level and identify that you're in a conflict between your fear of pain and your desire for health. Then look for a third way for dental health without pain. For example, why not devote a week to making a really intensive, careful search for finding a pain-free dentist? Going to the meta level makes you active, not just reactive. I want this, but I can't. I want that, but I shouldn't. What do I do? You step back. You become active. You set the context now. Going to the meta level to look calmly at what's going on, what the issues are, what you're feeling and why, makes you immediately identify yourself, your ego, with your conscious mind. The man who is stuck at the first level, rather than going to the meta level, is half reason, half emotions. He's caught up in the thick of the conflict. Without going to the meta level to introspect, he is, in Ayn Rand's phrase, a prisoner trapped inside his own skull. Now, this is a directly volitional issue. Are you going to be active or just reactive? Does your conscious mind run the show, or have you abdicated so that you are coasting mentally? Do you take the reins? Do you oversee what's going on in your inner computer? Or have you surrendered control to the automatic functions of your subconscious? Conscious or subconscious, who's the boss? That's the issue in life. You make the conscious mind the boss, in large measure, by stepping back, going to the meta level, looking at what's happening in the interaction between your conscious and your subconscious mind. In order not to drift in a semi-conscious daze, in that memorable phrase of Ayn Rand's, one has to regulate one's subconscious. One has to monitor what is going on in one's mind and judge honestly the results. The rewards for doing so are objectivity, control, and happiness. Thank you. Gary.
In light of your thoughts on how to develop a healthy psychoepistemology, can you say anything about Miss Rand's point that art is man's psychoepistemological conditioner?
Yeah, I can say that that's true. Really, Doctor, that's a good point, Gary, because while I was listening to Dr. Peikoff lecture on that topic, I thought, gee, I should have put that in my talk. But as you see, I already had 15 minutes too much in my talk. I wouldn't know how to say it better than he has, but it struck me in listening to his lecture on great art as the conditioner of the subconscious that it is good preparation for exactly the kind of mental filing, or it's good training in exactly the kind of proper mental filing that I was talking about. It's training in essentialization. Now, speaking of training, speaking of childhood, I thought of something I should have added as an example yesterday under the topic fixating. Remember that in order to store something in your memory, you need to pause on it, fix on it, take a little snapshot of it. I was talking to someone after the lecture, and he reminded me of what we see on television now. You know, these fast intercuts where nothing stays on the screen, the camera is always moving? That is a sign of out-of-focusness and breeds out-of-focusness. And the worst offender here is Sesame Street. When Sesame Street first came on, I thought it was cute. I thought it was a great idea to teach the kids the alphabet. I mean, very, very young kids, the alphabet and the numbers, make it fun. They had a lot of humor. It was entertaining. Held the kids' attention, but they were under the influence of Marshall McLuhan, a pseudo-intellectual of the 60s, who said, you have to have a hot medium where things go by real quick. That's what keeps kids' attention. Kids have a short attention span. You have to keep things moving, or else they'll turn away from the set. what you're doing is preventing the child from fixating on anything, preventing the child from pausing on anything, conditioning him to being out of focus. I think that fast intercutting, that constant motion and change is the worst possible thing you could do. Better a kid would not learn the alphabet and not know his numbers than be trained to let his mind, be like those things on the back shelf of the cars with the heads bobbing around. Okay, Jason?
I've had several experiences, usually when arguing with people, where either a certain idea that is proposed by my opponent I'll have a very strong gut reaction against it. Either that, or sometimes it's the other way around. I'll come up with something and I'll have a very strong gut reaction for it. And it's very frustrating because I can never articulate in these times exactly why I oppose or support a particular idea. And often later I'll think about it, and very much later I'll have a complete validation for my position, and I'll turn out to have been right. But it's very frustrating in those times. So I guess I have a theoretical and a practical side to this question. First off, can you explain how you can know whether an idea how you can have this reaction and have it be right without understanding it fully? And two, what do you do in those times when all you can say to your opponent is, well, I really don't like it?
Okay, I'm going to answer that on the meta level. Distinguish communication from cognition. Distinguish a conversation and changing the other person's mind from understanding the thing yourself. When you're in a conversation and somebody says something that strikes you as wrong, for instance, he says, well, time travel is certainly possible. And it strikes you, no, time travel, that is not possible. You could go back and kill your grandmother before she met your grandfather, and hence you wouldn't exist, but if you wouldn't exist, you start thinking things like that. But he says, what do you mean it's not possible? Why isn't it? Now, one thing is the burden of proof is on him to show it's possible, but even aside from that, chances are you can't answer him. That has no significance whatsoever. So he will persist in his error. So what you should do is go to the meta level and say, in this conversation, I was unable to, as you just did, I was unable to explain my very strong sense, which doesn't count as knowledge, but my very strong sense that this idea is crazy. Some future time, I will figure out, if I'm still interested, just what the hierarchy of concepts is here and why travel in time is wrong. It's a stolen concept, but you maybe wouldn't know that. And so I would say the most calming thing you can do, and the most helpful thing you can do, is separate yourself from polemics with other people. Yeah, you didn't convince this guy, that's his loss. But you learned something, you made a little note in your mind, this is an interesting topic. I have to think about the relation of time to movement. And so you actually, if you didn't go to the meta level, what you come away with, chances are, is, gosh, I lost, I feel bad, I'm down, I should have been able to answer that, but I can't. I feel impotent and weak and so forth. It's very destructive. If you go to the meta level and you say, what just happened here? I got a sense that what he was saying was wrong, but I couldn't prove it to him. How important is that to prove it to him? It's not important at all. It's for him, not for me. I didn't help him out, in effect. But now, is this an interesting issue for myself? Yes, it is. So you come away thinking, hey, I've got a key to learning something here. That was a great experience. Too bad for him I couldn't clear up his confusion, but I'm ahead of the game now. And you got self-esteem boost. So that's a good example of going to the meta level. How does this happen psychoepistemologically? You know an idea is true, or you know an idea is false. I put no in quotes. Before you can prove it. Well, by the nature of the way it's filed in your subconscious, you know that the concepts line up in one way or that they don't line up in the way he says. You get the sense when somebody says time travel is possible, you get an emotional signal from your subconscious that's the equivalent or result of that being a stolen concept. Your subconscious says, hey, I can't get there from here. So there are signals from the subconscious. They're like error messages that you get on your computer. And you have to learn to pay attention to them. Sometimes they're positive messages, like, hey, this is very fertile. If I keep asking questions here, I'm going to get a lot of answers. It doesn't have to always be negative. But sometimes you get file not found. Sometimes you get unknown command. Sometimes you get, I can't get there from here. You've got me running in circles. And that's what time travel involves the stolen concept. So you can do it because by the way your files are organized, some contradictions result in a certain, in effect, emotional sense. So you know that something either integrates well, and that's the sense that this sounds right, or it can't be done. You can't get there from here, in which case your reaction is clash, contradiction. It won't work. It's false. Okay? Yeah.
I know that in my experiences, I've had some situations where I thought I was on the meta level, but I actually was not.
Really?
Like I would send an email to somebody saying, I am angry, and proceed along that line, thinking that I'm being very explicit, when in effect I'm actually just abusing the other person. And I was wondering, wondering how you might think you might know that you're on a high enough meta level. Are there multiple meta levels?
Well, there are, but they're not relevant. I mean, you could say, I just thought that I am angry with that person. And I just thought that I'm angry. But that's not productive. You're either, the clue to whether you're in the meta level is whether you have a certain distance, a certain separation from the heat of battle and from the emotion. Now, this doesn't mean repression, but this means that even if you think you're right, you are still there. There's a definite sense of you're here inside, looking at yourself, looking at the outside. So just saying that you're angry is on the meta level, rather than saying, you fool. Say, I think what you did is upsettingly stupid. That's already on the meta level, but that doesn't give you the right to then slip back to the primary level. So I don't find that myself, but I would say look for the results that you're after. Look for a sense of objectivity and distance. Okay?
You don't think there are multiple meta levels?
No.
Okay.
There are, as I say, there are, but there's statements about statements and statements about statements about statements and statements about that. You can always say, and that one too, but it's not a helpful one. John.
Often when I'm trying to teach a concept, I want to I want to concretize it and give a diverse number of examples. Sometimes, though, I find that I've given a diverse number of examples, but it really is my listeners' borderlines, as it were. All right. So it's like, for example, I'm trying to argue that a number of I teach psychology, so I'm trying to argue that a number of psychological tests are really testing the same thing, and they're so focused on this one. It's almost a frozen abstraction on this one thing as being the test of such and such, that they can't get beyond, and so I'm trying to figure out how is it that you
range.
Right. So how is it that you can give a diverse number of examples and get a concept as opposed to a frozen abstraction, and know what on earth is their frozen abstraction?
I have to cut you off because we're almost out of time, right, Pam? Again, it's the same issue. Distinguish communication from cognition. I was talking in the context of figuring things out for yourself. If you're talking about communication, and your audience has too narrow a concept, you have to deal with that first. I wouldn't start with examples. I would start with, how wide a field is this? What do we take as a test? Maybe I can take one more from Amy. The last question.
The last one. I'll ask the practical one because I have a nitpicky technical one. The practical one is, what do you do on a daily basis to reprogram your filing of concepts according to proper genus? I mean, you talked about how it should be filed, but do you, on a daily basis, when you read an article, say, I wonder if I've filed this concept incorrectly, or that was what I was wondering.
Yeah, I do. I look for the signal. This is vague. You get an uneasy feeling. You're reading along and you see a term that you're not used to, because this is not a process. The process of finding a genus is not something that has to go on for years. There are only a certain number of genera, because you're collecting, by definition, you're collecting things into wider classes. So for instance, from man you get to animal as a genus. That covers a pretty wide territory. From animal you get to living organism as a genus. That's a very wide territory. And the only thing about that is entity. And that covers everything. So it's not like the process of finding a genus is not something that you have to work on for years and years and years. But sometimes you'll find a new concept where you don't exactly know the genus. And that's where you have to look for it, and you'll see a feeling in your mind, I don't quite know what to do with this. And that's what you have to monitor for. The topic that I had to cut from the talk, when I can't even put in a question period, is pay attention to the signals from your subconscious. If something is vague, you'll get a signal. If you don't know where to put something that you're reading, you'll get a signal to that effect, an uneasiness. I don't know where to put this. And the key is to look for that. And if it's important, say you're reading sports, you don't care what a hat trick is, then don't bother with it. But at least notice, I'm vague here, I don't know what it is, I don't know where it goes. But if it's something that you care about, and it's vague, just ask yourself, don't ask yourself necessarily at first to give a whole definition, just ask, what category does this go in? And then one final thing, and Pam, I will stop. It's very helpful to know the widest possible genera of all, such as entity, attribute, action, relationship, because you can always run up to that. You know, like a hat trick is an action. It's not an entity. It's not a relationship. I know that much. So you can always get some very, very broad genus and then try to narrow it down to the proper genus, proper size genus. And that's a big aid. But the main lesson is pay attention to your emotions that result from the process of cognition going well or going poorly. Like, this is a little vague, I'm a little uneasy here. That's all you have to do. Okay? Thank you.